Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 4 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book describing the history of politics from the ancient Greeks to the modern day. This time we're covering Chapter 3 about Aristotle and how politics is not philosophy. So last time we covered Plato and the more philosophical aspects there with his sort of touches on politics. But this time with Aristotle, we're getting some more concrete, like political thought. Finally, I guess we've had two chapters of more or less philosophy and history, more so. Now we're finally moving into direct politics, I guess you could say.
Yeah, political theory, which is a form of philosophy, but a little bit more practical than Plato's BS.
Yes, I figured you'd say something like that. We're back.
We're remote, and I'm in my basement.
Mm-hmm. I'm in my small apartment
next to the sewer pipe.
Yes,
and so I've ordered your younger brothers not to use the bathroom on this side of the house. Otherwise, the audience will hear a loud flush go down the pipe next to it. I'm in the unfinished portion of our basement.
Yes,
so I just want to let our listener know that if somebody forgets and goes to the bathroom, you will hear a loud flush.
That's fantastic and probably not information that we needed to broadcast to the internet. But thank you for that tidbit.
Well, I think it probably suits me well to be next to a sewer pipe. I think our listener appreciates that.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's the listening experience all of our millions of listeners are here for.
Your mother said she would not be quiet if I were in another room upstairs. I think it was a form of hostility and lack of support of my podcasting. I will deal with that. Right. I will deal with that later.
That's a little threatening. I don't know if I like that.
Most likely by apologizing to her, even though I've done nothing wrong. It's a lesson to you.
All right.
On to Aristotle. There's a whole different. It's not the politics of dancing. It's the politics of romance.
Yes, that's lovely. Thank you for that.
80s song reference, politics of dancing. For that,
all right.
Who's now in their 50s.
Moving into Aristotle, thank you for the side information there. We kind of start off with here. Alan Ryan just gives a brief, biographical description of Aristotle. He was actually very involved in the politics of his time, very different from Plato in that respect. He was the tutor, of course, of Alexander the Great and father-in-law of Antipater, the general placed in charge of Greece in 334. So he had some very important connections back in the ancient Greek world. He was born in 384. He came to Athens in 367 to join Plato's academy. In the next 20 years, he saw Athens' revival after the Peloponnesian War and the extinction of the city-state's political independence following their defeat by Macedonian forces. So he kind of saw this revival, and then ultimately this decline over these 20-year periods after they were placed into Macedonian control.
It's almost unbelievable to me that Aristotle lived at the same time as Alexander the Great and was his tutor, his instructor. And this guy conquered half of the known world at the time or more, I guess.
Yeah, no, that little bit of history is always fascinated me because you could do like a direct line of teachers from Alexander the Great to Aristotle to Plato to Socrates. And it's like you could just track them very clearly, and you can do a little bit afterwards, especially with Socrates's other students or Plato's other students and stuff like that. But the amount of like just direct connection there is kind of incredible.
It really is, and there's something in the water back then.
So he left the academy after Plato's death and spent time in Lesbos, where he was supported by the tyrant Hermias, a former slave who had bought ownership of the city from the king of Persia. In 342, Aristotle was summoned by Philip of Macedon to tutor Alexander, and so Alexander was ruling Macedonia entirely. In 335, he returned to Athens to found his own school, known as the Lyceum, and his friend Xenocrates was head of the academy. And there's a little bit of an interesting distinction between the two schools, the academy and the Lyceum. The enthusiasm for empirical investigation kind of existed around the Lyceum. Aristotle founded the discipline of politics by having his students describe and analyze 158 Greek constitutions. He combined practical wisdom and attempts to show the best state is best by nature. And that's kind of his overarching goal as we move through the rest of this chapter. But it's interesting there, the more practical, almost more hands-on, while still kind of combining a little bit of that sort of Platonic ideal sort of system, a little bit with like the best by nature idea, but definitely more practical than the academy was at the time.
Yeah, and I have a preference for that, of course, and And
We're
I don't,
aware.
I think for the practical theory of it, but the and I don't, I think all of those constitutions have been lost.
All
They,
but
they were
one, I
referenced,
think they said.
yeah, well, Athens,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And yeah, but they all these little city states have their own little constitutions, and the theory was that they were in the Great Library of Alexandria, I think,
Mhm.
that burned. So I mean, it's such a loss, that they tried 158 different versions of some
Mhm.
sort of governmental entity during that period of time. A lot of it concurrently at the same
Yeah.
time, or the cities developed one after another, and they're now lost. So we'll
Yeah.
just have to keep doing it over.
It'd be interesting to know like how different each of those were, if they were very similar. Of course, Athens was pretty different than a lot of the others, and Sparta was kind of different from a lot of the others, but kind of like the middle ground between those two, it kind of makes me wonder like, are they kind of like the US states where they all have a constitution, but kind of the constitutions run parallel to each other, say largely the same things, or are they very different systems of government like within those city states themselves? And I mean, it's almost impossible for us to know at this point.
Right. Yeah, that's why I'm lamenting it.
Yes, I
A
can
lot.
tell. So Aristotle's position in Athens eventually became untenable. In June 323, Alexander's death provoked open revolt against the Macedonians, and so Aristotle retired to Chalkis and died there a year later. So because of his direct connections with Alexander and the kind of occupation of these Greek city-states, the Athenians were not too happy with him towards the end of his life, and he retired and died in peace eventually. Anything to say about the biography of Aristotle there?
No.
All right, moving on. Aristotle's political prejudices is the next section here. And this is interesting. Alan Ryan kind of made a big point out of these two kind of concepts here. They're kind of combined into this one concept. But Aristotle definitely had a prejudice, as Alan Ryan describes it, against women and slaves. He says that the relation of master to inferior is a basic and natural human relationship. And so he applied this to women and slaves. He actually suggested ways to regulate the capture of slaves, but he did not criticize the practice itself. He believed that some people also are natural slaves and that they had less capacity for self government. In the same way, women are rational enough to fulfill their subordinate role in the family, but have too little rational capacity to give their own judgment in the political arena. So, kind of this idea that some people are just suited to be slaves or suited to be inferior because of their natural capabilities, and kind of justified this to say um, women and especially slaves did not have the same rights as men, and in fact, it was proper for them to be subordinate to free men.
Yeah, and I think the author did a pretty good job of explaining that, and but it's I'm a little uncomfortable with it. The part of it, I mean, the first line he says, modern readers find several of Aristotle's views deeply repugnant. That's how he started that section. I thought, uh-oh, here it goes. And it's true, of course. Yeah, but I don't know why. I don't like the tendency to try to moralize from present morality to what occurred, 2000 plus 2500
Mhm.
years ago. I don't need the editorializing. Why don't you just state the
Mhm.
political views? But I guess he has to kind of get that out so he doesn't lose the modern reader,
Well, he
or
also
act like,
kind of
or
kind of
he's afraid that he's going to be an apologist for Aristotle's pro-slavery views or something. I don't know.
well, he also kind of justifies, why he points this out here because he says, this was commonplace in the Greek world. Why is it surprising that Aristotle held these beliefs? And this is kind of how he ends this section. I'm going to read from the book here. He says Aristotle talked to many intelligent women and had every chance to change his mind. He had every opportunity to reflect on what the existence of Hermias implied for the justice of slavery. In short, modern readers might think that the remedy for Aristotle's blind spots is a more diligent application of the empirical methods he himself advocated. So it's not just saying, we're better off nowadays, this is terrible morals of the time. It's more so looking at Aristotle, somewhat contradicts himself in a way by saying these things. And, maybe he could have looked at his own theories a little bit better. It's not just saying, he was evil and we are good now. It's just, he himself was saying some of these things and had experiences that you would think would change his mind about these topics.
Yeah, sure. I guess that's a polite way to look at it. The the present time, though,
Mm-hmm.
we have a lot of people who believe that others are inferior because of their class or their political affiliation or their skin color. And it's like it's becoming more predominant as opposed to less predominant than it was, when I was a kid. And I think it's a big problem. And we don't have legalized slavery, but we do have classes in our society. And I don't know if what's really, really key. I started keying in on it with the mask mandates, where we have servants in masks waiting on us, and they're paid, but they're not paid enough to not be our servants anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, if they get two jobs, yeah, you can get in. And I'm not one of those people that's a Marxist that believes you can't, in a capitalist society, you can't make something of yourself. But boy, there's something to the modern day slavery or servant class, I should say, that's not much better. I mean, you have your freedom and all that kind of stuff. I'm not equating the African American slavery of the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, and all that stuff, but there's a lot of moralizing about how bad slavery was without recognizing we have real class issues in present society that everybody just wants to ignore. You look at, there was just in the headlines the other day that Ron DeSantis, shipped these unlawful, I guess I should say, documented foreign citizens from Florida to Martha's Vineyard, and the people there, of course, could not countenance it of it, and they were whisked away by the military within 48 hours, which is all well and good, but they weren't whisked away to their country where they are documented citizens, as opposed to undocumented. I don't know who these undocumented people are. Everybody who's born in the world today has a birth certificate and they're documented foreign citizens, but that's a different rant. But anyway, but they're like a different class, and we can't go to Martha's Vineyard because we're not the wealthy class. I guess I can go there to visit and maybe go to the shops, but pretty sure I couldn't buy a house there.
Yeah,
I couldn't afford it. And so there's it kind of rubs me the wrong way to say, well, we're so much better than them, when we have our high and mighty people insisting on, like, especially during the pandemic, well, we don't have to wear masks at this party, and we're wearing dresses and tuxedos or suits that cost as much as these people's annual wages. And to stand back and serve us drinks and water and wear mask face coverings and almost have to bow before us. And boy, it just rubs me the wrong way. Anyway, sorry about the rant.
No,
it's feeling that. And I'm feeling throughout this, when we talk about the slavery, I don't think that we're that much removed from it. The African American slavery, it was only a relatively short period of time from now. And this whole class thing is really getting worse, I think. And I think it's going to explode.
We could talk about that a little bit later, because there's some direct thoughts
about revolution.
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit later. So then he moves into teleology and how that relates to nature and politics. And this is sort of Aristotle's big thing. He says that the behaviors of entities are explained by their telos, or their end, their goal, their purpose, or their point. So everything essentially had a purpose. It had some sort of designated goal that it needed to get to. It says that everything has a natural goal, and it is unnatural in Aristotle's view for men and women to have equal rights. That was not the goal of men. The goal of men and the goal of women is two different things, essentially. He says that the natural forms of life were good because they filled their natural purpose. So that's essentially his criteria for good, is finding the natural purpose and fulfilling that, and that's how you live a good life. It says nature is the ground of social norms. Discovering what is natural uncovers both the way things are and how they should be. Says there's sort of a hierarchical nature of these goals. The highest things aim at the highest goal, and human beings at the top. So human beings at the top of all of creation. Everything else is essentially below them in terms of animals. It says the way to discover what nature aims to achieve is to observe what nature actually does. So look at what happens when things turn out well. So essentially he says, the natural way for things to progress is to progress in the correct way, to progress into their goal. And so we can kind of learn what things want to do by observing what they are doing right now in the moment. And so this differs very much from Plato's idea that the world we perceive is not the true world of forms. The world is as we perceive it, though our senses can sometimes deceive us. So successful explanations of the world should explain why it appears the way it does. It's not that there's, some sort of unknown form of things that's, clouded our judgment by the material world. It's that the material world is what we are seeing. We have to trust our senses and kind of observe the world around us, which is definitely a more practical point of view. He says the study of politics is a form of natural history. Political analysis should aim only at as much precision as the subject matter permits. He says the statesman and the citizen's needs are important. In ethics and politics, we seek knowledge for the sake of action, practical disciplines. This is kind of where he says, this is what separates it from philosophy. We're looking to get something done. We're not just trying to find objective truth for the sake of truth. We're looking to actually make some progress, make people's lives better. So we try to improve our ethical understanding to live better, not to gratify curiosity. The individual is intended by nature to live and thrive in a polis, so the polis is prior to the individual. And this is an interesting point where he gets into, what's more important, kind of the city or the person and stuff like that. But he says politics is the master science or art. It aims to discover the conditions under which the best state can come into being and flourish. He says we understand citizens by understanding the polis. So he says, we need to figure out the way that we achieve what is best for the individual is to figure out what is best for the government that they are under, in which they can flourish.
Yeah, and it's a different way of looking at things than we tend to today, is because he's trying to look at what is a healthy society and a political society, how is it ordered, and it exists prior to us and it'll exist after us, and how do we manage that and manage that system and moving forward, and that's really his study of politics. It's a practical review of, okay, how do we achieve justice and the benefits for the most people, that type of thing, structurally, and what's the best form of that government. But it's like it doesn't focus on the individual right or the individual person or people creating a government. He almost looks at the polis as like society, the culture that you're in, and then you use politics, which is a formal structure of that organization, to try to achieve an end. That's where the long discussion in the book about what's the purpose of an individual or even an item, like an animal or a plant or an object. Well, you define it by its purpose.
Yeah.
You define the typewriter by, it's a mechanism that puts letters on paper, so you can write words, and that's what defines it. And that, because he's when he's talking about his philosophical discussions, you have to figure out, okay, what is, it's going back to the philosophy from our season one. How do you describe what is and what is not, and so that's what his whole philosophy is okay, what's the point of this thing? What's the point of this society? What's the point of this animal or this plant? Well, it has a purpose to recreate or whatever the case may be.
And I feel like that's almost something that's missing a lot of the times in the modern world. I know Alan Ryan especially says, in terms of science, we don't really think about teleology. We think of things just, describing them as they are, and, things are almost random. But I think, when you get into like political discussions, especially, when we get into like the moral issues of the time, like abortion is a good one. Sort of thinking about what is the intended purpose of an abortion. Because a lot of the times when you get into these discussions, people ask you, well, what do you think about war? If you're for, banning abortion, should we just ban all wars and stuff like that? And you have to think about, what's the goal or the purpose of each of those actions? The purpose of war isn't to kill, innocent civilians. But from the point of view of someone who's anti-abortion and things like that, the point of an abortion is to end an innocent life, essentially. And so it's like you can't really conflate those two, because, they have very different intentions and things like that. And I feel like the sort of intentionality of a lot of actions is kind of lost when you're looking at these discussions.
I agree. No, I agree, but I also disagree, because the purpose of an abortion is to end the inconvenience.
Yes, sorry. But the purpose of the medical procedure, I guess I should say, like the procedure itself is the ending of that life. That is the goal of a successful abortion.
Yeah, the way you look at it.
Okay.
But you know what I'm saying? So I think there's something lost about defining something by the intent, because you have to decide what the intent is. Now the result is the killing of an innocent baby, but the intent is to avoid responsibility for past decisions. Generally, I know there are exceptions, but the vast majority of abortions, 90-something%, are out of convenience because they just don't want to have a baby now. They're expensive. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
still dealing with you, and that was 19 years ago, for crying out loud. I'm reading this stupid book. And so anyway. So, but I agree with what you're saying, and I would expand on that, and that we even when you're talking about non-controversial subjects or relatively non-controversial subjects, like, okay, what do we do about homeless
Hmm.
people? And it's kind of tied up with a weird morality, as opposed to what the hell will work.
Yeah.
How do we maximize? How do we minimize the number of people that are homeless and living on the streets? And how do we maximize the effectiveness of what we're doing to make to allow these people to be productive and happy and own their own home, for crying
Hmm.
out loud? Instead, we're saying we don't want to punish these people, and we want to focus on the morality of it and support them. Okay, well, that's all great, but what are you actually achieving? Are these
Hmm.
people not homeless anymore? No, if you pay them money, I mean, the vast majority of them are drug addicts or mentally ill. And so if you don't address those problems, and I'm sorry to go into some detail on this, but that's lost. It's like, why don't you try to figure out what is the best course of action practically? And that's what Aristotle was saying. If you have a system set up, you have a polis, people that is focused on trying to solve the problems of society, you're going to focus on, okay, what's the problem? How do you fix it?
Hmm.
And we don't have that right now. Various levels of the government, especially in the federal level, and that's the real failure. We're led by a bunch of imbeciles who aren't trying to get the job done. They're,
Yeah.
they're just trying to posture and then collect a paycheck and go to parties,
Hmm.
and that's it. I mean, they're an aristocracy of fools, overeducated without knowledge. I don't know how they can be educated without knowledge, but somehow they get degrees. They don't know anything. They don't know how to do anything, for crying out loud. I could go to San Francisco. If you make me the tyrant of San Francisco, I could solve the homeless problem in a year. It would take me a year because there's so many of them, but I could solve it. And any one of us could, if we just decided, okay, wait a second, we're gonna deal with their problems, and we're gonna get these people off the street, and we're gonna stop paying people to be homeless, because there are a lot of people in San Francisco that are not from San Francisco.
Yeah.
Because if you're a homeless person in St. Louis, why would you be? If you can figure out a way to get to San Francisco, you go to San Francisco. You got unlimited drugs. You can poop on the sidewalk. They pay you. They pay you to be homeless there. You can get really cheap drugs because the supply is crazy easy to find, and you got all sorts of social services and handouts. And I mean, it's really they're encouraging it, and it just doesn't make any sense because it's such a horrible life, and these people are stuck in this cycle, and nobody's saying, okay, what works? And
Hmm.
that's what Aristotle is saying. What's the point of government? What's the
Yeah.
point of a political system? It's to figure out what works best to solve the problems and to deal with things. And we've gotten away from what Aristotle is trying to tell us to do and to
Mhm.
focus on. And our governmental system is not functioning
Yeah.
correctly. And Aristotle would agree.
Yes. That was
How
a
about
good
that for a rant?
that was a good conversation about teleology that turned into an anti-San Francisco rant. I really appreciated that one. That was good.
Well, it's not anti-San Francisco. I've never been there, but I understand it's beautiful, and they have such tremendous resources, and it's just a waste of mismanagement.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire state of California was it was like the um, golden land. I mean, literally the gold, of course, the gold rush, but so many resources,
Yeah.
and so much wealth and physical beauty, and they're just wasting it all
Mm.
on a bunch of nincompoops that refuse to run the state. I mean, I just don't get it. But
Yeah.
anyway, they are not Aristotelian.
We
They
should move
are
on to the
Platonic.
yes.
No, they're Platonic because
Mhm.
they're trying to create a utopia,
Mhm.
because they have these Platonic ideals and they don't waver from them.
Yeah.
And they have this small group that they don't have one person, but they have a small oligarchy that just says, okay, this is our ideal, and we're gonna push this through,
Yeah.
and who cares what the practical effects are? Anyway, let's move on.
I mean, yeah. I mean, that kind of that just made me think of something. The scientific method itself hasn't really been invented yet, but Aristotle's approach is very similar to a precursor of that. Let's look at what's working, let's look at what's not working, and let's try to do what's working. And if stuff stops working, let's try to look back at it and figure out what went wrong. It's essentially just a big test just by examining the world around us and just making sure that everything is working as it should, and kind of examining the results and the goal of all of these actions.
Right. And if you cared about these homeless people, you'd figure out, okay, what is working to help them get off the streets?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's tough.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a secure facility. So meaning they can't get out for 6 months while they undergo psychiatric and drug treatment.
Mm.
Because I mean, really, that you have to invest in it, but you're spending so much money on these people anyway.
Yeah.
But they're renting hotel rooms on daily rates to because then they're not homeless. They're still homeless, man. They still don't have a home they own
Yeah.
or they rent or have control over. You could pour that money, but you have to make the decision to have the legal structure they used to have in this up until the 60s or early 70s, where they wanted to deinstitutionalize mentally ill,
Mm-hmm.
and they did, but they didn't have a plan for them once they're out. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why we still have this intractable homeless problem. Now there are problems with institutional setting because they were not properly funded in many cases, and they were not monitored, and so there's a lot of abuse, a lot of neglect. But the solution to that was not to just dismantle the whole system. They should have improved it, and it's been going on what 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
50 years it's been a complete failure, and nobody is saying, wait a second, this isn't working either. Maybe we should try, as Aristotle would suggest, a middle way, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what his thing is. Well, you want this extreme, you want the extreme, let's try to get a middle way. I'm segueing back into Aristotle.
Yes, let's
You
let's
know,
get there
where
eventually.
there's still a way to have people forcibly institutionalized, because it has to be by court order,
Mm-hmm.
and it has to be long term, and then have services such as outpatient care and temporary housing, so you can get people back on their feet, and boy, you can make a real difference in everybody if you're really paying attention. Of course, you'd have people that'll fight over when you're taking away their civil rights, and you are. But isn't there a benefit to them and to society to have them in a secure environment where they're working on their addictions and their mental health issues, as opposed to just living on the street and stabbing people?
Anyway, moving back to the book. The next section is on ethics and the politics. So then he says that in Aristotle's opinion, ethics is the study of living well. What is the goal of human life? And how do we get there? He says life goes well when we achieve happiness, but we need happiness approved by reason. It's not just whatever makes you happy. It's a good happiness, essentially. He says that nature intends us to enjoy the happiness of a good person. To make progress, we must examine the particular virtues and discover how they contribute to the good life. So essentially, he lists a bunch of virtues, essentially. We don't need to get too much into his ethics here because they don't apply too much to his politics. But it's essentially, looking at what is good in the world, how that contributes to the good life, and making sure we're following those things. He says that a successful polis must be built on justice. And justice, as he defines it, is very different from Plato's definition. He says it's the distribution of authority and power according to political virtue. He says states are just if their citizens live just lives. An ordinary, reasonable person can practice justice and will wish to do so, but it is enough if such a person wishes to be just only under non-extraordinary conditions. So essentially, this is kind of an argument against, Plato's idea that only philosophers are just and things like that. Plato says, or Aristotle, sorry, says anybody can be just, but, he doesn't have to be just in this, extraordinary, utopian society where everybody has a specific place to be. You could be just in living your life. And that's enough to have a just society. And he kind of goes on to the ideal state much later. But really, anybody can be just. It's not just reserved for the philosophers.
Yeah, he has an interesting. I'd be here to get to an interesting comment about whether humans are always going to do what is in their best interests, and there's a summary of it. But the author says human beings seek their own well-being, but not always effectively. When they fail, something has gone wrong. Now, it could have gone wrong in decisions they made, or it could go wrong and other external factors that kept them from getting something done.
Yeah. He says that there's no guarantee that the just man will always do better, which was, Plato's idea. He says a society of just persons will always do better than a society of unjust persons, but it cannot be guaranteed that every individual will thrive. So just because the whole society is just and you are acting just, things can happen outside of your control. Things can always go wrong.
Right, right. And so, and you're right. He makes the great caveat that a just society is better, but it's not always going to end up with the right result.
Yes.
And Plato says, well, if you set up and everybody's just, then it's going to be a perfect world. Well, Aristotle realized, well, in theory, but
yeah, it's impossible in practicality.
Right. And so why even talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Then he goes on to say, the ideas of, selfishness and, seeking our own goals. He says that humans are not 100% selfish. We pursue many goals, each with its own point, and each genuine good has its place in a well-conducted life. So this kind of counters, the arguments we saw in the Gorgias and in the Republic of people saying, well, humans always act in their own best interests and nothing more. But here Aristotle says, yes, but not necessarily. There are occasions in which, we do act in our self-interests. Self-preservation is always a thing that we want to achieve. But at the same time, there's just factor after factor and goal after goal that each person has. It's not just what do I do that will immediately grant me satisfaction here. He says, what is good for us is connected with what we want, but what is good is not defined as what we want. Misguided wants undermine the pursuit of our own good. So kind of going back to the teleology argument, naturally, we are inclined to accomplish our goals and things like that. And so naturally what we want should be what's good for us. But of course, there are dozens of misguided wants out there, to make sure we want the right things and accomplish the right things as well.
Yes.
Yes. All right. So then he moves on to talk about political analysis. And Aristotle's method of political analysis was to have his students discover the political arrangements of Greek cities. So a very, very practical way of analyzing, politics and things like that, just what is written in these constitutions, a very hands-on approach. And so Aristotle wrote the Politics, which consists of eight books. The last two describe the ideal state, and the first six break down more practical political theory, all the issues of that time, citizenship, and the checks and balances on the government, as they would come to be called, but just things like that. And the Politics was a sprawling work. Many issues come up over and over again, and the Politics may need to be read slowly. I like that comment from Alan Ryan. In order to really digest what's in there, you have to read it slowly. So it's a very, very big book. Have you ever read the Politics?
Not all of it, but I did read a lot of it. I do remember reading his the last book where he talks about his utopian views. And I do remember reading that. I don't know if I took a class in utopian thought, or at least that was a section of the class, if I remember correctly. And so we went over that, and I didn't really care for it either. But.
Yeah. Well, I know, and you're not much for utopias though, so maybe you would have enjoyed the first six books a lot more.
Yeah, I don't enjoy utopias or these communes or cults or any of these things that say, well, we can do it all better and there won't be any problems.
Fair enough.
It's just a waste of time and effort to even think about such things.
So then he goes on, he kind of breaks down what's in the Politics itself. And he starts with, what man is in relation to politics. And so Aristotle says that man is a creature intended to live in a polis. Man is a political creature. And he makes three observations along with that. The first is that all associations exist for a purpose. And as the most inclusive association, the polis exists for the most inclusive purpose, the ultimate form of human organization. So secondly, the polis requires no association above it. It is self-sufficient and sustains complete life. And third, the correct way of governing a polis is unique to it, not the same as other relationships. The state is not a large family. So with that last one especially, he's countering, the Republic, in which, is kind of structured as, everybody will just look out for each other because it's all a big family, essentially, and things like that. But yeah, he makes some good observations here, essentially the hierarchy of, the polis, needs to be self-sufficient, needs to sustain complete life. And because, it is the most inclusive, the biggest category, it should essentially serve the biggest purpose in, being the ultimate form of human organization there.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if they had better functioning families back then, because even families fight.
Yeah.
So it's and later he talks about what his ideal state is, that it can't be more than, I think it was 10,000 people.
10,000,
I mean,
yeah.
A lot of his theories are based upon a much smaller governmental entity than what we're dealing with now. just with the size of the populations and all that.
Mm-hmm. He then goes on to say that the polis provides the environment in which humans can best fulfill their potential. But the best of human lives is that of philosophers' contemplation. So this is here, he still kind of borrows that from Plato, the philosopher will live the best life. He says, those who do not have the tastes and aptitudes, that's a hard word for me to say, aptitudes of a philosopher can lead the best life for themselves in the polis. So even if you're not a philosopher, you'll still have your best life. He says, the man who doesn't need the polis is either a beast or a god. The philosopher aims to think God's thoughts and so becomes self-sufficient outside of the polis, which is another little slightly pompous remark, of course, because Aristotle is himself a philosopher and studied philosophy. So, he is thinking the thoughts of God naturally.
Well, I don't think he's saying that. I guess you're
Yes,
being facetious, but
being facetious.
he's like, if you don't need society, then he'd term you a beast, and you'd
Mm-hmm.
just be like the wild.
Yeah.
And if you think that you don't need to be part of society, that you're above it, that you're thinking of yourself as a god, and the only way that works is if you are a god. And so he's basically saying neither side works, and you're going to be part of society whether you like it or not.
That is true.
And it's a kind of an interesting philosophy, and it talks about women and slaves and all that, where it's kind of like you do what you can, and you have a place in society. Now, some of that would make sense because if you're not a great artist, you're not going to be a painter,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, it by having these large categories, slave and denigrating women, you're limiting the entire class
Mm-hmm.
to not be able to achieve what they could otherwise achieve. And so that's really what should be the criticism of his philosophy, as opposed to just saying we're better people now.
He then goes on to say, like, the way that we should look at how society is structured, we should first look at relationships, because the society is a group of villages, or the polis is a group of villages, and the village is a group of households. We should first look at the household, see how it functions. And even though the state isn't a family, it's important to look at what does work in a family. He says that, he looks, to see these differences in familial authority and political authority, but also what is the same. He says that man has the domestic authority to ensure that the family flourishes as a family. And so he says that's sort of the same way that political authority should work. You should have political authority to ensure that the polis, flourishes as a polis. He says here that Aristotle bequeaths to posterity the thought that the extent and the nature of the authority that sustains human associations are determined by the functions for which the association exists. That is, by the nature of the association. Locke's analysis of the authority of government in a second treatise published in 1690 relies on just this thought 2 millennia later. Whether through Locke's influence or by some other route, the thought itself is enshrined in the American Constitution with its commitment to limited government and the measuring of authority by the goals to be sought. Which is interesting. We can kind of trace that all the way back here. What he's saying is, to have this authority, you have to have the right goals in mind. And that goal should be to have the society flourish. It should be no other goals than that if you have this authority.
Yeah, we've completely gotten away from that, but he's absolutely right. You have to set up and participate in a government political system.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing it right, you should be doing it to better the society and the political structure, the people
Mm-hmm.
that are involved in it. And I think that's what my point was earlier, is that we've lost sight of what actually works. And it's quaint to look at our Constitution and talk about limited government. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. That government is gone, and now we have to deal with what we're going to do with it in its current state.
He then moves on to talk about slavery a little bit more, because slavery does play a large role in Aristotle's sort of political descriptions. He says, if a man is to have leisure to play a role in the political life, then slaves must do the labor, and he refers to them as animated tools. Really, anyone could be enslaved in ancient Greek times. They were typically taken in war, and they were not always treated poorly. Of course, we do have instances of people, laboring pretty awfully, but by and large, the slaves were not treated poorly. And the others,
I don't know that he's saying that. He's saying there's relative treatment of slaves.
True.
I don't know that we could say that there were a bunch of slaves that weren't treated poorly. I think they were all treated poorly. It's just a matter of degree. Some of them were habitually tortured or worked to death, literally, or poisoned because they're working in certain mines that were poisonous over the long term. And others were, had more, maybe just farm laborers, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I
Yes.
interrupted you.
No, that's all right. He says that an owner could not just do anything with a slave. The natural order is that a natural slave has only enough intelligence to follow instructions. So again, that's kind of his justification for slavery. Certain people just aren't smart enough, essentially. He says, however, slavery is conventional, and most slaves today may even be wrongly enslaved. So he's kind of looking at the practice right now, and he's like, well, maybe we messed up a few times. He says the master should treat the slave in ways conducive to the slave's well-being.
Now, when you're looking at this and you're reading this, think about it. Just change the word slave to clerk or servant or like where it's not a slave, and
Yeah.
tell me that's any different than our modern day aristocrats looking at the help, the
Hmm.
staff,
Hmm.
like at a restaurant or a club or their house. They just change slave to staff,
Hmm.
and it's the same attitude. And he's saying, well, Aristotle said these, described that they just don't have the aptitude, and that's why they're slaves, and that they're in the position. That's all they could do, and we need to take care of them, and justifying slavery. Well, what's the difference between that and our current attitude towards people that are staff?
Yeah.
We're saying they're not smart enough to do something better. They're not, or the way the Democrats look at Republicans, well, those dumb, deplorables, like Hillary Clinton would say, or what did Biden call us? I forget what his term was for it.
Fascists.
Well, yeah, that's a more recent one, but
Yeah.
it was a deplorable. It's something similar to deplorable, that we don't have the capacity to understand the complexities of modern life, and that's why we're relegated to the hinterlands. I think there's a lot of interest. I mean, I think reading summaries of Aristotle, and I haven't read Aristotle's, translation of it in a long time, but I'm seeing a lot of similarities between the way he viewed slaves and women
Yeah.
with how a lot of our aristocracy views the servant or staff
Hmm.
um, classes of society.
That is true.
It's the Karens,
Yeah.
like to put it in popular terms, the Karens, how they treat staff,
Hmm.
complaining about, I want a refund and demanding all this extra service and free stuff, and to be treated as if these people are servants. And that's really what the Utes have really picked up on, is that, my God, these people are treating us like we are their servants. We are their slaves. Now they get paid a wage, but not by that person. It's by somebody else. And so
Yeah.
I'm being paid by a third party to be your slave.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
really kind of a contractual servitude. Like I'm paying Starbucks $10 for a coffee. Now write my name on it and give it to me. And the Starbucks pays you $15 an hour or whatever wage they're paying you. And you better damn well give me my coffee with my name on it. And it better be hot, slave.
I mean, I kind of disagree with you a little bit here because it's not like, these people are forced into these positions. I know in some cases, it's hard to find a
What
better
else are you gonna
job.
do? What else are you gonna do? You got no education. Let's say you have a couple convictions, and you dropped out of high school. What the hell else are you gonna do?
Hmm.
In today's society, how do you make a living? You're in the service industry. And what is the service industry? Hourly paid servant.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're lucky if you get benefits.
That is true.
Aha!
That is true.
I'm turning full Marxist.
I was about to say, but I'm gonna see you next episode. You're gonna have the hammer and sickle on your shirt or something. I don't know what's going on tonight.
Well, I'm going full Antifa. When I'm rereading this, I'm seeing so many similarities, and because it's not like I keep going back and not like it used to be. I'm becoming an old man, but there really is a class distinction in our society that has to be dealt with, and it's become really corrosive.
Hmm.
But
Interesting.
anyway,
Yes,
so
then
sorry
he
to
goes.
interrupt, but I think it's an interesting thought.
It
And
is.
when you look at these old philosophers, and if you read how people in the South justified slavery,
Hmm.
and you look how Aristotle justified slavery, we're not we're paying people to do the work, but boy, it's not directly. We're paying
Yeah.
a third party, and the way we treat people,
Yeah.
our servants
I would
is the
say, yeah, I
problem.
would say it's less of a fault with the system itself. Like I think if the system, works properly, then I think, those workers are fairly compensated and things like that. Where I agree with you where it's like, the attitude to these workers needs to change. It's this person does not have to serve me my coffee. And I think what needs to happen is a lot more people need to get kicked out of a lot more places. If you're going to
Right.
treat the employees like this, just get out. This is not what you should be doing.
I think the ruin of our society was when they decided the customer was always right.
Yeah.
But if you look at where Aristotle's saying fundamentally is that if you don't have a just society,
Hmm.
you can't have a just. If you don't have a just people, you can't have
Yes.
a just society.
Yes.
And our people have an illness today, and it's going to be a lot to overcome it. How like a sickness in our attitude and our spiritual health, and it's a problem.
Yeah.
And that you're right, you're absolutely right. It's not really the capitalist system; it's
Hmm.
just the people in it.
Yeah.
And how do we fix that for crying out loud? I
Because
don't know.
I worked customer service at Lowe's over the summer. You know that, and there were many times when I wish I could have just hung up the phone or just told a person to leave because it's just like you come in here and I'm supposed to fix all of your problems. I'm paid close to minimum wage. I have no benefits. I've been here for 8 hours. I do not care if your hose is broken and you are screaming at me to get you a new hose. Like this is not technically it is my job to deal with you, but I do not need to deal with you in the state that you are. Like I don't
Right.
think so many people don't realize that I am much more inclined to help you if you ask nicely. If you come in here
Mm-hmm.
and demand that I help you, I am 10 times more likely to say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I could do for you. The amount of times that I like bent like Lowe's company rules just to give people refunds if they just came in and asked nicely and you're like, I bought it. I know it's outside of the refund policy, but blah 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 blah. And I'm sorry about this, et cetera. I'm like, it's fine. I'll just give you in-store credit. Not supposed to do that. But if somebody comes in and they demand that I give them this and it's past the refund policy, no way. I'm saying no, there's nothing I can do for you. That's not going to happen.
Right. Right. But anyway, so that I think that you're in the antidote for anybody who's has rose-colored glasses about American society. Like, oh, everybody's so wonderful. We're all good people. Just has to work a couple months in retail,
Yeah,
and it'll
true,
dissuade you of it.
true.
And it's not representative because there are thousands of people that came by your play,
Hmm.
your little station there or whatever. It didn't bother you. You just came in and bought their stuff and went
Yeah.
home, went on their way. So you can become cynical, but I think there's too many of us.
Hmm.
Uh, and we all fall into the trap of expecting too much of other people and all that. And I know I do. And but there's a problem.
Yeah.
And Aristotle, I think 2,500 years ago, knew that
Hmm.
if your people are not a just people, if you're not educated, uh, and you don't know things, and you don't contemplate
Mm.
the right way to act and the right way to behave and interact with people, the whole society is going to be in trouble. That's where we're at.
True.
Anyway,
Yes, moving back to the book, he makes an interesting point that I think we brought up a couple episodes ago, and that there are climatic and cultural or economic reasons why some people can practice politics. It kind of mentions, in the cold and the barren lands, people their time is just spent just trying to stay alive, and they can't practice politics. There's nothing more to their lives than just, living to the next day. And he says that the Greeks were uniquely suited to politics by nature, climate, and economy. They were situated in the right spot at the right time, with plenty of resources and trade and stuff like that to really focus their free time on politics and developing a better society.
right, and boy, that was true. I
Mhm.
mean, they hit the sweet spot at that time. They had the right amount of population. They had the best weather. They had subsistence crops they could operate independently on not a huge amount of acreage and not too
Mm,
much labor.
yeah,
It's kind of funny to think now our problem now is too much leisure.
yeah,
It's like we're on the opposite end of it. Everybody has enough time to contemplate, the political structure, and then almost everybody in America has a phone that has access to unlimited information about the world, about science and technology.
hmm,
And what do? We play video games,
yeah, hmm,
or we look at TikTok videos or whatever the
true,
case is. It's crazy. But
yeah,
he's right. There has to be a certain amount of leisure in order to even think about it. And a
mm,
lot of people, they say, well, half the public doesn't vote. Well, of course, I'm always in favor of that because anybody else who votes dilutes my vote. Uh, but if you're too busy or you don't care and you're not paying attention, but he's right that if you don't have enough time to read or to pay attention, you're not going to be an informed citizen.
True.
Yeah,
Then moves on to Yes. Sorry, he moves on to economic activity, and this was some of the most interesting stuff in this chapter. And later on, when he talks about economics, he says that the mean between austerity and money making is ideal for politics. We don't need to be completely destitute, but we also shouldn't be just making money for the sake of making money. He was very skeptical of Plato's obsession with abolishing private property. He said that the use in common encouraged public spirit, but production in common could never be efficient. So, you're using the resources that are freely available to everybody, and that promotes nationalism or pride in your state and stuff like that. But it can never work that we're all producing something, essentially for the whole state. He goes on to say here, he saw a truth that the state of much public space reinforces today. We do not think that what belongs to all of us belongs to each of us. We think it belongs to nobody, and we neglect it. For man to have an incentive to provide for his family, he must think of it as his family. To have an incentive to look after his farm and crops in the most productive way, he must see them as his. Aristotle argues for private production and common use. So essentially, if we're looking at it, if everything is everybody's, essentially, what goal is there in me to help produce for it? If I could just freely use it and stuff like that, what's my objective here? I kind of need to have that personal need to produce for myself. We need that private production.
Yeah, you have to have a sense of ownership in your job, in your life. And if you don't own anything, everything goes to crap. And that's the fundamental foundational problem with communism. If you don't own it, you aren't going to make it better. I mean, it's like they say, nobody washes a rental car.
Yeah.
Because why would you? You just rent it for a little while, and what do you care?
Yeah.
Nobody does landscaping on a rental house.
Mm-hmm.
You don't go out there and put a new retaining wall and plant a bunch of bushes and trees if you're just renting it from month to month. If you don't own it, you don't take ownership of it. Same thing with a job. If you don't have any sort of ownership and pride in what you're doing, you're not going to do a good job because why would you?
Yeah. He then goes into like pricing and things like that. He says our natural needs set the bounds of acceptability in pricing. So essentially, stuff should be priced according to how much we need it. He says the way money is worth things is unnatural as it bears no relations to the items being bought or sold. And that kind of raises the question of what is the value of money itself. He kind of concludes that there must be a true or natural value that undermines prices. So this inspired his condemnation of usury. Things useful to life are organic in that their creation and use is part of the natural cycle. He says, reading from the book here, money is helpful when it promotes that cycle. It itself is barren, mere metal that cannot produce offspring as trees and plants do. Usury is therefore unnatural. The man who made his living by lending money at interest was setting barren metal to breed. As an unnatural way of making a living, it was to be deplored. So it really places emphasis on, the very natural means. He says, the most productive activities have clear cycles of production than consumption. Produce it, then it's consumed either by you or somebody else, in exchange for something. But making money has no such beginning and ending. What is produced and what is consumed when I lend money, with interest and stuff like that. What am I producing and what is the person consuming, and stuff like that. So it's a compelling argument, against usury and stuff like that. Really thinking abstractly about what money actually is and why it has any value at all. It's a fascinating discussion there.
Yeah, and when you look at it, of course, economists know a lot more about this than we do. But when it comes down to it, what is the value of a dollar? And we're seeing that when you print a whole bunch of money, if it's not based on a fixed value, then the value of the dollar declines. And if your country doesn't produce stuff, but you're just the financial services hub, how do you have wealth? And we have a lot of paper wealth, and unless we keep producing stuff, it's all illusory, and eventually it'll come crashing down.
True. He says the polis is best governed by moderately well-off men who draw their livelihood from farms on which they do not work, that would make them they do not do work that would make them unfit for public life. So essentially going back to kind of the idea of being in the right climate and stuff, you have to have a moderately well-off population of people that are essentially going to be making the decisions. They can't be wrapped up just trying to keep moving from day to day. You have to have that free time and things like that.
Well, and it was more true then than now. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't think people understand how tough
Yeah.
the world was back then, where you just worked from sun up to past sundown just to be able to feed your family.
Hmm.
And in those circumstances, you don't care about politics. You just want to be able to live another day and hope to feed your kids,
Yeah.
and hope that we'll all die from some plague.
Hmm.
I mean, it was brutal. I mean, life expectancy was what, half of what it is now.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it makes a lot more sense then than now, because there's so much leisure, we have so much time, and we have the opposite problem: too
Yeah.
much foolishness, lack of seriousness, and nobody even knows what work is.
Mm, fair enough. He then goes on to talk about citizenship and constitutions, and this is like two of the very central themes of the politics. He says Aristotle seeks ways of allocating rights, obligations, and power that are least likely to provoke discontent. That's really one of his chief goals in writing about politics. What is the best way to make a stable government? He says citizenship is the right of political equals to rule and be ruled. He says membership of a polity is not Aristotle's concern. Citizenship isn't just, who lives here, who gets the benefits and stuff like that. It's who rules and who is ruled. He says we must find virtue in a mean to determine who can safely be given citizenship. He says if there is a difference between one man and all others, such as there is a difference between men and animals, then that man should have absolute authority. Unfortunately, there is no such difference, but there are important differences between rich and poor, free and slaves, men and women, etc. And so the equality that citizenship implies is found in the mean. It's not that there's, one man who's better than everybody else, but it's also not such that every person should be considered equal, at least in Aristotle's eyes. So, citizenship should kind of be the middle ground there. It says the test for citizenship was whether a person was naturally autonomous. Someone who was not self-governing domestically could not be part of self-governing political community. So such if you can't take care of yourself, or if you didn't have the natural tendency to be, self-sufficient, as he saw, women and slaves, then you don't have the rights to be part of a self-sufficient political system.
Well, he's not just talking about women and slaves. He's talking about
Yes.
guys too.
Hmm.
If you can't manage your own affairs, why are you involved in making a decision for the rest of us?
Which is
That's really what his argument is, and it's a pretty decent argument.
I mean, yeah, it still holds true today in elections. If you look at the person, who's, in financial trouble and stuff like that, you're probably not going to vote them into office. If you can't handle your own affairs, why are you handling mine?
Are you kidding me? They're all
Yeah,
deadbeats. They're all deadbeats.
fair enough.
They're all the take. But we would hope that they wouldn't be. I mean, local politicians have filed for bankruptcy and had all their debts discharged, and nobody cares because so many people who vote have done the same thing.
Yeah, true. And then goes on to say that no Greek could really be uninterested in politics. It was understood that the upper classes would try to restrict citizenship eligibility, so all classes need to be politically active, at the very least for self-defense. He kind of says, they're almost always at war within each other. It was a very unstable system at the time. You had to be politically involved just to make sure somebody doesn't come by and steal all your stuff. You make sure you make some of the right decisions. Then goes on to define what exactly a constitution is. He says it's the set of rules a polis adopted that allocates functions to institutions and lays down who possesses the right to participate in political decision-making and how decisions infecting their polis are to be made. So a very general sort of definition of a polis there, or of a constitution there.
Did you skip my my favorite quote from Trotsky? Did you
I
skip
believe I might have, if you want to say that one.
Yeah, well, he's talking about the people
Mm-hmm.
and whether they should be involved in politics, and he said, this is a quote from Trotsky. You may say you're not interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And he learned that after he was murdered, or before he was murdered in Mexico.
Mm. Fair enough.
I don't know if you know the story of Trotsky. He had to
Not
flee one of the communists in the Soviet Union, early, I guess, early rival ultimately of Stalin.
Yeah.
Lenin, really, I guess.
Yeah.
And he was murdered with an axe, or like a hatchet, I believe, in Mexico.
Lovely. Going back to what he says about constitutions and that sort of idea of, controlling who possesses the power. He says, if the best could rule, everyone would do well to obey them. There would be no need to have checks on the best. If somebody is by nature the best person and makes all the right decisions, then they're going to look out for the totality of everybody. But he says that's never really going to happen. He says the difficulty especially lies in the transmission of political wisdom, how to find the best and ensure the best rule. Because he really thought that these qualities were almost genetic. If you are the best, how do we make sure that that's passed down onto your children? You would find, very virtuous men would have awful children. He says it's completely unpredictable to see how these people turn out. So we really can't determine, power by those grounds. He says talent for political rule is not widely distributed. It is inherently aristocratic. It is not reliably inherited, so hereditary aristocracy is imperfect. He says that the solution, although Aristotle didn't realize this, is non-hereditary aristocracy, which is really what modern representative government is. Essentially, that we select the best few among us to rule for everybody. It's not hereditary. It's not passed down from father to son. It's essentially the best, a very small selection of people rule, but we have collectively decided that they are the best for the job. It's a non-hereditary aristocracy in a way.
Yeah, that's it in theory.
Yes, in theory, yes.
In theory, that we were picking the best.
Mm-hmm.
Really, we're just deciding bad choices among bad choices.
True. He says
every time.
Mm-hmm. But it is kind of interesting, like how long it took, for people to kind of realize this idea of the sort of representative democracy, as we call it, because to these people living, either thinking that democracy was the best or aristocracy was the best, it was a very unpleasant middle ground for everybody involved. It's if you're pure democracy, right. You don't want to select few ruling, but then if you're very, pro oligarchy and things like that, or pure pro aristocracy, you don't want people to choose who the select few are that are ruling. And so it's an interesting middle ground, and it does make sense how long it took for us to get there.
Well, I don't know that it took that long. The Romans had a form of it,
yes,
with the Senate and an assembly, and then they had like, well, we'll get into it in the next chapter. I'm trying to. They had certain controls for it, depending on the era and the Roman government. So it had been tried with the benefit of all these great Greek writers, because the Romans stole a lot from Greece.
Fair enough.
How do you like that? I like his idea of a lottery.
We're not there yet. Yeah, we're not there yet.
Next page. Where are you at?
I'm on page 97.
I'm on page 99.
You're a little bit ahead of me. I'm moving on to Aristotle's classifications of constitutions. He kind of says,
already in there.
We are not quite yet. We just got there. I just read the title, believe it or not. So he says that, true aristocracy is best in theory. If we could have the best ruling us, then that would be the best system, but that will, never happen.
Didn't you already say that? You already said that.
I've said it in a way earlier. He then goes on to say that there are three virtuous forms of government, and those are kingship, aristocracy, and politeia, which are either one, a few, or many possess power and employ it for the common good. And there are three corrupt forms, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, where one, a few, or many govern in their own interests. He says democracy is pretty much always corrupt, as he defines it. The demos are the poor many. And he says, so naturally they would use political power in their own interests. He was very anti the poor having political power. He says the problem in designing a constitution is how to incentivize using power for the common good. He says narrow democracy, or politeia is the word that he uses to describe it, is the solution. The lowest class is not permitted to hold most offices, but the requirements of birth and wealth are not as strict as an oligarchy. So it's not that you have to be, the absolute best, most wealthy, most highborn, but it's also not, if you're very poor, you can't really make the decisions. It says unbridled government will not work. We need to ensure the state functions as it should. And he says, makes an interesting point here. This is what you're saying about the lottery. If we wish to achieve equal influence and equal share, then a random lottery for power is uniquely effective. He says here on page 99, I've finally gotten to page 99, the fact that most people flinch from that conclusion suggests that, like Aristotle, they do not wish for equality of political influence above all else. They wish to secure both the benefits of aristocracy and the benefits of democracy without the defects of either. If we achieve this, we shall have created a politeia, the state that Aristotle claims is on the whole best and most likely to solve the problems that beset a political community. And that's a great point there. because you
Mhm.
hear all the time, especially on college campuses, that what we need more than anything is equality and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, I bet if I asked any of those people, are you in favor of a lottery for who becomes president or who becomes your congressman? Everybody would say no. I mean, it's a terrible system. In theory, it works if all you want is equality and completely equal influence and power. But then practically, it would never function because we understand that certain people are better suited to politics.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with you anymore.
Really?
I mean, do you think that we would be better or worse off if we had a lottery among the, let's say, there's 330 million Americans.
Hmm.
Let's just there's going to be less of that be eligible for the presidency
Hmm.
because the age requirements.
No.
So let's say there's 150 million people that would be eligible to be president of the United States.
Hmm.
Do you think it'd be better for us to choose between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, or just have a lottery and pick one of us at random?
I would say, literally right now at random
Literally,
would
yeah.
be much better. But if we're talking in theory, if we want to design a system, then an election system, such as what he says is the non-hereditary aristocracy would be better, given that the people that we are choosing between are good options. I think.
Let's go back 4 years. Do you think it would be better to pick between Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or any random other person by lottery?
Any random other person.
Yeah, don't you think?
I
What
do
about
think so.
before that? And who was before that? That was Obama and Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, Obama, or any random person picked by lottery?
Any random person.
Okay. Let's go 4 years prior. John McCain or Obama. One of those two, or any random person chosen
Any
by lottery.
any random person.
I,
But the
I'm,
point that
I, I'm
I was trying to make, like if we were going to set up a political system, I think we would more people would choose an election system, such as the non-hereditary aristocracy over a random lottery. I think by and large, people understand that some people are better suited to serve in politics than other people. Hence why I am choosing the random person because I understand that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are both not the best option to serve in politics. And I think by and large, there are more people who are better suited to serve in politics, and choosing someone at random would find that better person. I think the issue isn't in the fact that we have an election system like that. It's just, how people, get to be in that election system is the problem.
I'm actually I'm converting myself to believe that we should, for like the next 2 cycles, just pick people at random for all federal governmental positions.
It couldn't be much
Congress,
worse.
yeah, Congress, the Senate, the presidency.
Hmm.
For at least those, so it's any random person from my district. Is that gonna be better than what's his name, Lutgenmeyer, who's out of some western or west from here
Yeah.
county, or well, Josh Hawley seems like decent, but Roy Blunt's our other senator.
Yeah.
Would it be better to have Roy Blunt or some random dude, that, and then give crash course on Senate procedure,
Yeah.
because a random dude might actually, or woman, might actually learn how to pass something in the Senate, maybe actually would write a bill that somebody cared about
Mm-hmm.
and had it passed. Maybe actually vote on it, discuss it, vote on it, and pass it. That would be a nice, refreshing change. I am now in favor. I've talked to myself. I wrote a good point on this part of the book because I thought, what? Why don't we just do it by lottery? What we all believe in equality. Why don't we just pick some random person?
Mm.
I'm in favor of it now.
I think you've convinced me. I think you've convinced me.
I've convinced myself only kind of like how we sent Trump to the White House just to give everybody in Washington a big middle finger.
Mm-hmm.
I think this would be the same type of thing. Let's just do a lottery. Just give those jackasses the middle finger and show them that a random person picked by lottery will do a better job than you. Because chances are we get some working class person.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about it, what's the odds? We're gonna have some duds,
mm-hmm.
right? We're gonna have some. Well, we have some crooks, but we have crooks in Washington anyway.
Yeah,
we have some duds that they'll be wacky and all that kind of stuff, but it'll be just good people They just work for a living and they'll be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've been entrusted with this serious responsibility.
Hmm.
I hope and pray I could do a good job. That's what most people would view the job as.
Hmm.
That's what none of our federal officials view the job as. None of
That's a great point. I'm on board. You've convinced me. That's a great idea.
them.
Uh,
Now we just have to get it done. Just
exactly.
have to amend the Constitution.
He then goes on to
Just
talk
for
about
10 years.
he then goes on to talk about the avoidance of stasis. And so Aristotle believed that there were two parts of a revolution. First, you had stasis, and then you had civil war. And stasis is when political matters come to a halt. The rulers lose confidence of the populace and cannot coerce obedience. And then this leads to civil war and eventually new rulers. And so Aristotle was very concerned about the tension between democratic and oligarchical factions. Says the democratic conception of justice fueled the argument that men with equal rights should be equal in economic advantages. So Aristotle didn't think revolutions are driven by need, but aspiration for economic equality. Says nature provides for the differences in intelligence and other virtues, and so the better off are generally entitled to their wealth. So he disagrees. Alan Ryan kind of compares him to Marx here. Karl Marx said, that these revolutions are driven by need. Aristotle disagrees. It's just driven by the desire for economic equality. And he says, on the other hand,
I don't know that he's saying just economic equality. It was almost like a sense of justice.
yes,
You have a certain positioning of it. It wasn't that he isn't saying if it's not equal, you're going to have a revolution. He's saying
mhm,
if there's not a commensurate amount of authority
mhm,
or power for your position,
yes,
writ large in society, that you basically have an imbalance there, and you're going to have a revolution.
mhm. Yes, generally, because that's what I said is that conception of the justice of democracy leads to this idea.
Right,
Yes.
right,
And then he
right.
says that the
Yeah.
oligarchical notion of justice is kind of the exact opposite. Their notion of justice is that those who are unequal in wealth should be unequal in everything. And so they want, power monopolized in the wealthy and not in the poor because, they have the better means economically. They should have the better means politically. And of course, as always, Aristotle, says the right answer is in the middle ground, of course, but he disagrees with both of these notions of justice here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He says for a tyrant to avoid stasis, he needs to keep his opponents divided and behave as a decent monarch who had come to power constitutionally. And then he gives some other advice for other systems of government. He says democracies are in danger of provoking revolution if they add to the distress caused to the traditional ruling elite when it was forced to yield power to the poor. So attempts to create an equality of wealth as well as an equality of power should be eschewed. Temptation to load all the burdens of public life onto the backs of the well-off should be resisted. And then he goes on to talk about, aristocracy, or oligarchies, they must strengthen those features that will make them less repugnant to Democrats and should endeavor to avoid the risk of a revolution in which the many revolt against being reduced to near slavery. So essentially, this the same advice on both sides. Don't do anything that would make your opponents angry enough to revolt against you. Keep your opponents divided. Keep them essentially against each other in a way, but also rule justly and coolly and don't, over exercise your power because that's what really turns the people against you. Behave as though you were constitutionally elected. Behave as though you were put into power in the right position, and your government will be stable enough to function.
Probably good advice and good rules of thumb if you're trying to
True.
avoid a violent civil war.
Mm-hmm. He then says that
I don't know. Is there a non-violent civil war? Probably not. I guess civil war would be violent. That was
probably by definition of being a war. Yes.
yeah. It's
So
not a
then
war of words.
so Aristotle's uh this brings up the idea of a mixed constitution, which is the advantages of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy within one constitution. But this wasn't necessarily, Aristotle's preferred method of, keeping everything in check and instability. His solution was economic. It was to match political power and economic interest. It says if there are a substantial majority of comfortably well-off people, that middle class, then the middle class will outvote the poor and not ally with them to expropriate the rich, and will be numerous enough to deter the rich from encroaching on the rights and wealth of their inferiors. So you need the vast majority of your population in order to kind of keep things in balance. And he says, this is what we must do if we cannot rely on the best man. If we have no clear, best man, it just has to be, that we have just a middle ground there between the two polar opposites and make sure nobody is trying to take the stuff from the other person.
Yeah, and he picked up on this 2,500 years ago. I keep
Hmm.
saying that, but it's so amazing because that's really the success of the United States
Hmm.
over the long haul was this ever increasing middle class,
Hmm.
and we've seen a reverse of that in the last 50 years,
Yeah.
and that's where it really has become dangerous because especially like with the the student loan issue because
Hmm.
people are going people are getting out starting their lives as independent adults with $100,000 in debt, and so you have a hard time buying a house, buying a car, starting a family, and all that kind of stuff. And so you have the super wealthy
Hmm.
because of the financial system, because they don't have to build anything or make anything. So they're transactional people
Hmm.
that like all the IT people are transactional in a way. I mean, I know they write code and they create those things, but it's not like stuff.
Yeah.
And they're super wealthy, and we're spreading into two classes: the servant class and the oligarchy at the
Mhm.
top, and that's a huge danger because when people like me shift into that lower class from the middle class, those rich people are screwed.
Hmm.
All right, they are going to get murdered. And I'm not saying I'm going to do anything. I'm not saying I'm a participator. I'm encouraging that, but that's the real danger. And that was always the success of the middle class because the middle class in America is steady and it
Yeah.
won't go to extremes. And like Aristotle described, it's a check on the super wealthy, the super wealthy few, and it's also a check on the masses at the bottom, because there's not that big of a mass at
Hmm.
the bottom because you're in the middle class and
Yeah.
you have stuff and you don't want to go to revolution. And if you have stuff,
Hmm.
if you don't have stuff, it's time to get the pitchforks because you don't have anything to lose. All
Yes.
right. If there's too many people that don't have anything to lose, they're going to find something to lose.
This
And so
really
they're
is
going
your Marxist revolution right now. I've seen you turn,
to.
full on, class divide and blah 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 blah. But yeah, I do agree. I know that this is a problem that, we are seeing, the middle class, slowly go away. But I don't think the solution is to install, a communist society, as some people would say. It's just to restore the middle class. That's just what we need to do.
Correct.
It's
But
absolutely the course of
you're
action.
right. You're right. I'm just talking about the danger. I'm not talking about the
Yes.
solution.
Yes.
Talking about the danger because that's not a solution. That just makes everything worse. But that's
Yes.
what's what happened. And Aristotle was right
Hmm.
back then. The hollowing out of the middle class, and the manufacturing base of America,
Hmm.
we're seeing that come to fruition,
True.
and it's dangerous and it's scary. I hate it.
He then
But
goes on to talk about.
we have idiots in charge that won't do anything about it because you know why? They aren't following Aristotle's advice and trying to figure out okay what works.
Hmm.
They're just they're doing their Platonic ideal bullshit,
Hmm.
which is saying, well, we have these ideals. Why doesn't reality just conform to it?
Yeah.
Oh, God,
Yes. Moving
do
on to
some
the
math.
final section here. We'll try to breeze through this one pretty quick because it's about ideal states, and we all know how much you love utopias. Um, but he starts off with saying that polity comes into existence for the sake of mere life, but continues to exist for the sake of the good life. For this to be successful, the state must practice politics in its essence, which is bringing together a diversity of people with a diversity of interests. It's all about that bringing together, making sure things are stable. It says people unite in a society by an agreement on the justice of the terms in which they do so. So, in order for a society to function, in order for people to come into it, they have to agree that the way of living, that the terms for living here are just. And politics achieves unity out of a plurality of interests and beliefs without suppressing them. And this was the fault of Plato's Utopia. It focuses on social cohesion and never changes. You have to realize that people have their own desires, their own wants. Things eventually need to change and conform around that. He says happiness is not the sort of thing that can exist in the whole without existing in the parts. Unhappy citizens will lead to an unhappy polis. That was another big issue in Plato's Republic. Of course, the society as a whole would be happy, but for the sacrifice of the people's happiness, and that just will not work. And Aristotle appears to criticize describing ideal states earlier in the Politics, but does so in books 7 and 8. He tries to answer the question then, how does a statesman ensure that the citizens are of good and amenable character? Of course, going back to, how do you make sure that people are happy to live in that society in order to keep it functioning? And so he kind of describes the town planner's ideal state. No more than 10,000 citizens, supported by an agricultural economy in which slaves supply the workers, and the citizens are fed at common tables. which is an interesting thing that he evidently goes into a lot of detail about, that people eat at common tables, located in strategic points. But I guess it does make sense going back into his, common use thing. If you bring the people together, see who they're living with and stuff like that, it'll boost, pride in the place that you live in. It does make sense to kind of have those connections there. And he says that it is
Well,
actually.
my that's always been my problem with the utopian thought is that they have a theory at one level, and then they have these minutia in another
Mhm.
level, and you can't envision the complexity of humans and human society. What you
Yeah.
have to do is you have to set up a structure like the U.S. Constitution as it originally constructed,
Mhm.
where you have a system set up so everybody's individual rights can be protected, and you have a system so that they can decide how to best organize their society and their government, and that because things are going to change over the, you
Mhm.
talk about 10,000 people in an economy, though that doesn't work. How do and he talks about how you can't have stasis. You have to have, there's going to be this and that going to happen over time. Well, the utopian is trying to say, well, this is a city on a hill. This is the end state. There is no end state in humans. There is
Yeah.
no end of history. There's always going to be some change and some chaos,
Mhm.
and that's fine and that's good,
Mhm.
because that's how we develop, grow. We're
Yeah.
explorers,
And
and
that's
we
where he
want to do
gets.
those things.
Mhm.
Correct. He gets tied up with all these details and stuff.
And this is where he gets into one of the biggest problems with his ideal state, in which he says that the state should have the authority to regulate sexual and family lives. He says he sets down strict rules governing the ages at which men and women should have children, and provides for compulsory abortion where women become pregnant in a way that might imperil population policy or produce unhealthy children. In the process, he begins a long history of controversy by suggesting that when miscarriages are induced, it should be before the fetus has life and sense, which he puts at the time of quickening. So of course
You don't see this author warning us about the dangerous philosophy of Aristotle about abortion.
Mhm.
You see it about slavery and the treatment of women,
Yeah.
but you don't see disclaimer that Aristotle's a terrible person because he's saying abortion under some circumstances is appropriate. And I object to his lack of objection, and he didn't pronounce that immoral
Yeah.
like he did the others.
Yes. But this is kind of what you were saying, if you have to have these drastic measures to make sure the state remains functioning, cap it at this amount of people, then it's really not a functioning state. It's very authoritarian here.
Right. It's horror. It's a dystopia. It always
Mhm.
ends up being a dystopia. Have you ever seen the movie Logan's Run?
I think I've seen parts of it. I don't think I've seen the whole thing.
You gotta see that movie.
Yeah.
There's like a small society set up, and I can't give away the ending.
Mhm.
But people only live to a certain age, and they have a little sensor on their hand, and once they hit that age, they have to go to what do they call it? They have a ceremony, and they float up in the air, and they get zapped by this thing in the top, and they die
Yeah.
because you live so long. They have a complete total population control, but
Yeah.
then they have runners that don't want to die
Hmm.
voluntarily, and so Logan, it's Logan's Run. So Logan becomes
Interesting.
a runner.
Yes.
Strange twist of fate. Anyway, you should watch that,
I,
although
I
it's
should.
R-rated.
Mm. He then goes on to describe sort of the first theory of liberal education. He says the value of an education, which is the value of an education devoted to knowing things that are worth knowing for their own sake. So essentially, that some knowledge is good just to know, even if it doesn't have many practical applications. Just to know a lot of things is a good thing. And he also says, interestingly, that well-bred young people should learn to play an instrument, but not with such skill that they be mistaken as a professional. For professionals were in demand in places of ill repute. So
Mhm.
another one of those weird little minutia things, because there was an association with musicians at the time as accompanying prostitutes and things like that. So of course, in his ideal society, we can't have any of that, which
Right.
is strange. He then, to kind of wrap things up here, Alan Ryan says, nonetheless, Aristotle's enthusiasm for the preservation of social distinction and his emphasis on the social position of the high-souled man remind us that even in his favored Politeia, with as many respectable and steady men of the middle class admitted to political participation as is possible, Aristotle hankered after the rule of true, that is, natural, aristocrats. If that attitude is not unknown 2.5 millennia later, his unconcern with those left out of this vision of the world, women, ordinary working people, foreigners, slaves, is happily rather less common. We shall not see much sympathy for ordinary lives and ordinary happiness for many centuries yet, certainly not in the work of Cicero, of course, leading into the next chapter, which will be Polybius and Cicero, beginning with sort of the structure of Rome. So what'd you think of the chapter overall, at that conclusion there?
I really like the author, even though I was a little critical of his, disclaimers. Easy read again. I mean,
Yeah.
if anybody is hesitating picking up this book, don't get into
Mhm.
it. It's not a page turning novel, but on this subject, I doubt we'd find a better book.
Mhm.
Aristotle was brilliant. I
Yeah.
mean, he's off on a few things, of course, when we all are. And he was a product of his own culture and society with the slavery and the women thing. But boy, he nailed so many important um, topics right on the head. I mean,
Mhm.
and to do it that long ago in, I mean, I wouldn't say a primitive society. I mean, obviously they had a well-developed constitution, but it was,
Yeah.
well, we were talking about however many, 300 years BC, I guess.
Mhm. Just
Is
about.
that right? Yeah, and for him to be able to still be able to make sense this long into the future with so many advances technologically in
Mhm.
society and in society. I mean, it's just it also kind of supports the theory that humans human nature doesn't change. We just
Yeah.
humans change,
Mhm.
and the stuff we have
Yeah.
and the convenience and all that, but
Yeah.
we're still the same kind of people.
Yeah, I really
What do you
enjoyed it. It's definitely I agree with them a lot on the teleology and sort of the middle ground, and also the very practical applications. Just look at the stuff around you, figure out what works and what doesn't, go from there. Not the ideals and stuff like that, but what physically works. It's just like you're saying, 2,500 years ago, and it still holds very true today, and more people need to recognize that.
Mhm. And he also had, I mean, it wasn't just kind of a utilitarian.
Hmm.
He had ideals about
Yeah.
a just society and for the benefit of the community, but so there were some grounding principles, but it wasn't just this utopian thought of
Yeah.
let's do what's right, and if we act a certain way or if we learn the certain things, everything else is going to work out. I vision that he would say, okay, let's try this, and then if that doesn't work
Hmm.
after we analyze it, we're going to try something different.
Yeah.
That's the rulers we want. And he has the kind of like the basic economic theory of the value of things based upon the scarcity and the cost of it,
Hmm.
which is an interesting precursor to the to capitalist price theory, the
Yeah.
supply and demand.
Hmm.
Yeah, just a fascinating character,
Hmm.
that and
Absolutely.
tutor to Alexander the Great. I wonder what he taught him.
Hmm.
He must have. I mean, of course, Alexander the Great must have been a very smart person and certainly brave and brutal.
Hmm.
But to have these uh, titans
Hmm.
of human history living in the same area
Yeah.
around the same time, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle,
Hmm.
Alexander the Great. I mean, almost unbelievable.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think we're. I
Where's
think
our
we're
Aristotle?
yeah.
Are you our Aristotle? I guess would that make me that would make me Plato,
That would make you
wouldn't
play. I think you would be more like Socrates though, because of your refusal to write anything down, or your many attempts, but never successes.
That's just from laziness. Maybe Socrates was just lazy.
Maybe, maybe.
Yeah, I'm with him. He never had any answers. I'm the wisest man because I know nothing. It sounds like something I'd say.
That is absolutely something you would say. I feel like your answers to a lot of questions would change depending on who's asking them. I think you would just try to make people angry at you. I think you would be very much like Socrates. How do I make this person mad at me for answering his question?
That is the definition of me in my youth. My teens and 20s, absolutely. Now I'm saying what I really think.
Yeah. All right. We
Uh,
should probably wind this episode down here.
Long one.
This
It's
was a
had
long
fun.
one. Yeah. This has been season 4, episode 4 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop,
Still Mark
and
Bishop.
you can follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. And that ran very long. I was
Mm.
supposed to be at the radio station like 7 minutes ago.
Oh no. For what? For that interview thing?
Yeah, it doesn't start until 9, but I usually go over there to get ready and stuff. But yeah.
Well, I won't keep you then.
But all of our listeners should tune in. I think you can
Oh,
listen to it online.
already
TMN,
signed off, didn't we?
I think the recording's still going. This will be in the episode. tmn.truman.edu. You can find me there. Monday nights 9 to 10 Central Time, and then Wednesday nights 9 to 11 Central Time.
Mm.
There you go. Plug in the student radio station.